we go. Good to see everybody. Welcome to our book panel. My name is Jeff Keuss. I'm at Seattle Pacific University, and I'm co-editor of our new volume coming out in the studies in Ricoeur Studies volume, which is Paul Ricoeur and the Hope of Higher Education, the Just University. My co-editor, Daniel Bazalon, will now be leading us in our discussion as we get into some of our panelists who will introduce you to chapters of our book and also centering our discussion on this moment in higher education. Daniel.
Hi, I'm Daniel Boskeljohn. I'm in Iowa City, Iowa. Fantastically happy with the project and eager to turn it over to our panelists who are have really exciting chapters. So I'll start with Charles Gillespie. Charles, if you want to start with just introducing yourself, where you're at, and then give a little synopsis of what your chapter was.
Sure. Thanks, Daniel. And my thanks to Daniel and Jeff for putting together this great book and panel. So my chapter is titled Reading Ricoeur Together, Interpretive Work and Surplus Meaning in a Just Pedagogy. And I'm Charles Gillespie, and I teach in the Department of Catholic Studies at Sacred Heart University in Connecticut. And I join you from my home in Norwalk, Connecticut. So in my chapter, I'm sort of looking at the productive distances that Ricoeur thinks happen in a hermeneutic moment. And what I try to do is apply Ricoeur's interpretation theory, primarily from his volume, Interpretation Theory, to thinking about how hermeneutics undergirds everything that happens in a pedagogical situation. And so I sort of look at the ways in which our being thrust to various places thanks to COVID-19 have asked us to think about how distances make things productive, but also what is the work of teaching and learning, and what's going on if there's this kind of surplus of human meaning when we interpret texts together. What I try to do is sort of figure out a way in which the aim of a just pedagogy would be to guide collaborative work that welcomes the delights of the surplus meaning of a university course, things like fun, laughter, even transformed lives that aren't necessarily the aim of a given course or its stated learning objectives that you might see in a course syllabus, but could be a human meaning that comes out of work together. I think that when pedagogy gets framed as or by Ricoeur's hermeneutics, we can see teaching as a way that seeks to make human meaning in the present and not something that tries to hunt for or deliver prepackaged data to students as consumers. Instead, we can try to craft classrooms that are characterized by interpretive hospitality, where we make enough room for wrong answers as being just as illuminative as getting it right the first time, but also raising collaborative questions. What ways can we make this text relevant to our lives in the present, and how to ask questions that raise that sort of discovery for our classmates as well. Because I think that's one of the ways that Ricoeur's hermeneutics helps us to think about a just pedagogy as something that answers the nagging anxiety of relevance, both for teachers and students. Why are we doing this task? And I think Ricoeur helps us see that to be a quest for human meaning in the text that we're reading, the conversations we're having, and the lectures that we're hearing.
So Charles, your chapter is just such a joy to read. It's like your personality and just the joy and the laughter and community and the sense of passion that comes with togetherness. It was really, really inspiring. And it's really, I thought, a really important contribution for the world that we're entering into with pandemics and police brutality. And since the book has been put together and now we have tragic issues with global warming and fires and derechos and hurricanes. So how do you think that, what did you learn from preparing this that you're putting into play in terms of how education works with justice, given the just widespread Pandora's box of issues?
Thank you for your kind words, Daniel, but also thank you for such a rich question. I think one of the ways in which working on this chapter changed the way I think about teaching, it's the sense that our contexts are constantly shifting. Whereas prior to our experience of COVID-19, or perhaps willfully, ignorantly, prior to our awareness of climate change or white supremacy and police brutality, I think there's a way in which that shift in context changes what meanings come out of texts. And so I think it's been about thinking of justice as a challenge to make sense of what our conversations mean for our lives today. But what do I mean by that practically? It's the sense that when we were sent home for COVID-19, spending time in class, checking in with one another as humans, reading these texts together, and seeing how they apply quite particularly to the strange experience of shifting ground, this Pandora's box that you alluded to. The other, though, is a sense that we were going to get things wrong. And if Ricoeur invites us to appropriate something that's foreign by making it familiar as a mode of understanding, that requires a kind of awareness that our first few attempts to make it familiar, to make fire or to make a pandemic familiar, aren't going to get it entirely right. And instead of feeling an anxiety that our quest is to discover the right answer immediately and get it, it's instead to kind of forge a community that's asking questions together. And I think that's aimed my teaching to be less about trying to have students feel a confidence that they're going to have the right answer immediately, instead to a confidence to ask a question of a surprising situation and go, what can we learn from this, either as a group, or even how can I take a first step to have someone else pick up the pieces with me as we try to figure out what comes next.
And that seems like a great way for you to talk about hope, and the hope that you think that higher education can provide the world after all of the dust settles from all of the things that are currently unsettled.
Sure. I think two things that higher education can do as we think about hope. The first is a hope for the fact that by working together, we're going to figure something out that we couldn't have discovered on our own. And that sounds facile at first, that it's better when there's a group, two minds are better than one. But I actually think in sitting with Ricoeur, we realize that two people will always encounter an autonomous text differently because they have different embodied experiences, different ways of life that they bring to the text where meaning emerges in front of it rather than something behind it. And I think there's hope in realizing that when we tackle the common problem of the world we share together, that if we do so as a collaborative community aimed towards joy, I think there's a chance of discovering something new that we wouldn't have imagined while we were alone. And I think that's the second point I would say with hope for higher education. In what we do is we gather together as a community to read texts and ask questions where our aim is to forge something new together. There's a great hope in the realization that as universities, we're adapting to changes on the ground all the time. And that makes higher ed a particularly interesting space for imagining a future that we don't have a blueprint for yet. Something where we're used to gathering together to change our perspectives because we get new students every semester. I think higher education can teach a wider culture what it means to keep returning to the same ideas, but asking ever and greater new questions.
Charles, it is always such a delight to interact with you. Thank you so much for just the joy and the beauty that you bring to the world in your teaching and to this panel.
Thanks so much.
Thank you much. And we'll, without further ado, move on to Laura Schmidt-Roberts. Laura, go ahead and describe yourself, what your role is, and what your chapter in the Ricoeur book was about.
Thank you, Daniel, and I too I'm so excited to be part of this project. My name is Laura Schmidt-Roberts. I'm a professor of biblical and theological studies at Fresno Pacific University in Fresno, California. And we're a Mennonite affiliated institution. My chapter is entitled Practical Formation, Teaching Critical Thinking via Ricoeur's Hermeneutical Model. And so I use Ricoeur's interpretive theory as a framework for teaching critical thinking, but defined as criticality, which includes thought and analysis, but more broadly is interested in the development of critical being through dispositions and engagement and action. And Ricoeur's hermeneutics are particularly helpful for this because of the way in which the ongoing formation of the critical formation of the self is central to the interpretive process. And as in Ricoeur's model, one moves from an initial understanding through explanation to understanding at a new level that culminates in appropriation. That isn't possible if there isn't this critical analysis of the text, but also really self-critical reflection, critique of ideology and illusions of the interpreting subject and all of that. And that the new understanding culminates in appropriation means that there is always this practical connection that for Ricoeur, it's a new way of being in the world that expresses itself in engagement and action. And that means that although the model, Ricoeur's model is primarily theorized as an individual interpreter, readers are always located in communities. and that culmination of a new way of being that is practically expressed in lives is happens in the context of communities and a society with civic engagement. In my context of teaching that in relationship to specific texts, I'm a Christian theologian, I teach in a Christian university, and so there's also a particular set of questions around authoritative religious texts that are part of the gift, but also the challenge of this model that is asking the role authority plays, individual interpreter, but also traditioned understandings.
So I'm curious, as you're talking about appropriation, especially in your background in the classroom of biblical studies and that kind of grounded authoritarian text, given and the questions about justice on the social level, how do you see the need for appropriating criticality is really coming into the foreground in religious-based education, given what the world has become in terms of questions about what justice means, especially amongst, or not especially, but including a lot of people who would identify as Christian? What is justice?
I think there are a lot of questions here in terms of this pairing that we see in Ricoeur of a hermeneutic of retrieval and one also of suspicion, right? So you have this strong impetus in Christian tradition toward questions of justice that sometimes, depending on which part of the tradition you're in, gets focused more in terms of an individual understanding as opposed to addressing larger systemic questions. And so I think one of the things that the context in which we find ourselves currently really throws into sharp relief is the way in which so many traditioned understandings, interpretations of biblical texts can move to a less critical examination of systemic issues, depending on who the community of interpreters is. And so the ways in which the global pandemic and protests against police brutality and the whole array of gaps and injustices that have been thrown into sharp relief by the situation in which we find ourselves. For Christian readers of scripture, this should press us to ask, whose interpretation, right, and whose justice, sort of which reality. So the question of how society defines justice is always a question of which part of society we're talking about. And so I guess that's the other thing I would say. My work on this chapter really, there are a lot of resonances with what Charles was saying in terms of recognizing the locatedness of readers, and we know different contexts shape a different reading, and what does it mean to be doing this work in a situation, a circumstance that is just persistently marked by disruption.
And to finish up, how would you quickly describe what the hope for appropriation would be when looking at the role that universities could be playing and might be playing in the near future?
This is, I have to do this one briefly. Disruption is this word that I'm sitting with, right? So I have this question about, well, I'll say it differently. For me, the hope of higher ed is related to the potential, the transformative potential of higher education, but that requires this sort of long and difficult work of sitting in the disruption, including the ways in which our own presumptions and assumptions and viewpoints are challenged when we encounter a different view or understanding. And so I find trying to do that work in the current context more difficult. How does one stay with students in a journey that requires them remaining in a place of disruption and discomfort in terms of their own self-understanding and their views of the world, their assumptions? That long, steady work is challenging in the current context because it doesn't happen incarnationally in the same way. And so of course, one of the future hopes is that we can do education in person, but it is this larger question of how the educational process presumes and makes space for disruption and conflict and question in a way that's more than questions of vocational training, and that is willing to ask really ask questions about why things are the way they are, especially in relationship to societal norms and practices.
Great. Thank you so much. It's good to see you again. And we will now move over to Nathan Eric Dickman. Nathan, I'll let you introduce yourself and your project, and we'll go from there.
Thank you. And again, as everybody else has said, thank you so much for bringing this project together. You guys have been awesome to work with, and I'm really looking forward to the finished product. My name's Eric Dickman. I work at the University of the Ozarks as assistant professor of philosophy. And the title of my project is Should Religion-Affiliated Institutions Be Accredited? Recur and the Problem of Religious Inclusivity. And this is coming out of a kind of red flag that I started to experience with administrators as a former chair of a department working on curriculum revisions and things like this, where administrators would use the jargon of, well, the accreditors won't like this, or the accreditors will object to this, as a form of bullying faculty and this kind of hostility toward change that administrators might fear and not understand. So for instance, a religious studies program that wants to, at a small liberal arts college that's religiously affiliated, might want to expand its curricular offerings from Christian-centered curriculum to a global critical curriculum. And you have administrators saying, well, our accreditors won't accept that. Okay, so as a professor at a small liberal arts college, I feel concerned at times about how many slacks claim affiliation with a religion or denomination of Christianity. In particular, my main worry is about the pervasive structures of religious privilege that these affect, how these affect religious minorities and religious studies programs at the same time. So we have the culture and the curriculum at stake here. And many of these institutions have non-discrimination policies and open enrollment, that is, they don't discriminate on the basis of identities, and missions that are explicitly devoted to free inquiry. Recur helps both with theorizing hospitality about religious inclusivity and with theorizing about critical yet free inquiry, as our other presenters have just explained. Approaching religions as languages gives some weight to Recur's semantics of metaphor, where religious symbols work as predicates to give intelligibility to our experience. So for example, if I say, what direction am I facing? I'm facing toward or away from Mecca. Or if I say, what time is it? You know, right now, a Rosh Hashanah just occurred, and so it's a new year, right? But that's not what people put on their checks, if people use checks anymore. Thus a hospitable, multi-religious community can translate, thus a hospitable, multi-religious community can translate and give, and they often give implicit fundamental discourses privilege, though, that where the translations don't always occur. That is, while a college might maintain some historical affiliation, using a recurring informed approach, the institution can be empowered to embody hospitality. And this is important with the political stances of religions and political stances of institutions. For example, like I said, a United Methodist affiliated institution, for instance, that's enforcing a ban on LGBTQIA+ marriage and ordination, might also have religious studies curriculum with ministry certificate programs licensed by the United Methodist Church. And so a student who might be part of the LGBTQIA+ community who wants to get that certificate might be not allowed to join that program. So I think accreditors need to have some sort of policy on how to measure the quality of liberal arts colleges in light of that. Well, I'm trying to police the police, basically.
Yeah, and it was a really fascinating chapter to be able to read. I mean, just to look at a point of view on colleges that kind of goes under the radar, but it has incredible influence on how education is done, how educators educate, or I mean, like you said, police themselves. Really quickly though, if you could just frame how you would look at how this take on things informed your understanding of how justice and education work together, and then really quickly after that, describe the hope that you have for the future based on all of the disruption, as Laura mentioned, that's been swirling around us.
Yeah, so COVID's made really explicit for more people the well-known inequities and political and social determinants of health that are studied in bioethics and healthcare policy. And protests have made more explicit for more people the well-known white supremacist system defining policing probably to its core. I think the best insights of my project can give is toward these is the aim of accreditation, at policy reform in healthcare, the abolition of ICE, police forces and replacement with community care, for instance. So again, policing the police, right? Like trying to figure out, but not getting rid of policing altogether. How do we replace it with a community of care? And going back to our other contributors, we're already talking about inclusive communities in the kind of specificity of our engagement with one another. So in terms of hope, you know, I'm finding hope pretty difficult right now. Cliches come to mind with like liberation, pedagogy for the oppressed and these things, but personally, I am not feeling hopeful, although I am listening to colleagues who express hope, and a historian recently noted that great scholarly achievements were done in earlier plagues, in the midst of plagues, right? And so education becomes a mode of coping with pandemics and tragedy. And I found that to be inspiring in as much as I could be inspired in a deflated context.
that totally works. So, and as always, as somebody who trained on how to ask questions, the questions that you asked for this book were phenomenal and really insightful. So I appreciate your work in doing that. And I'll cut you off from here and move on to Howard Pickett and go ahead and take, I mean, this picks up right off where Eric was talking about with some of the problematic social institutions. And go ahead and describe your project, Howard.
Sure, and thanks Daniel and Jeff and everybody for this project and for this panel. What I found in Recur by bringing together is philosophical anthropology, specifically his work on the capable yet vulnerable self. When you mix that with his late career work on the ethics of recognition, what I found in there was an implicit argument, at times darn close to being explicit, but at least an implicit argument for a positive right to high quality humanities education for really for everybody, but in particular for individuals either who are experiencing incarceration or were formerly incarcerated. And so as I lay out in the project, what I find so impressive is Recur seems to really grasp in ways that most of us don't, that the ability to tell a story about ourselves that links together disjointed pasts and presents, which may be especially disjointed in the case of incarcerated folks, and then also to weave together past and present and situate our singular selves within larger social symbolic orders, again, often quite complicated for folks who have been labeled as mere felons, right, or ex-cons. That is not just something that's worth doing or something that's sort of good to do, but it's fundamental to our humanity. And because it's fundamental to our humanity, then something like a positive right to the means of achieving that narrative identity or that narrative capability, at least, seems to be brought out in Recur's late writings, raising questions of, well, who has the institutional responsibility to do that? And Recur's work on the criminal justice system and also his work on higher education seems to suggest that it should be a joint project between those two types of institutions. And not sort of relegated to them, but to them as representatives of the wider civil society. So that's what I'm finding there.
And your chapter wins the, I think, most clever title I've ever seen with Recur, Doing Time and Narrative. Like that was a work of genius on its own. But the content of your chapter,
I think we call that a corny dad joke, actually. But
well, I'm a corny dad, so maybe that's why it works for me. But the real sense of looking at prison education, which you can see popping up a little bit here and there in smaller pockets, I thought it was just an incredibly timely analysis of why that was so important. Can you do a little bit just by talk about how that's hitting, especially in a time when police brutality, the injustice of the incarceral system, the problems of the pandemic in the prisons? Like, can you just, like,
Sure.
in 2 minutes, pigeonhole how this chapter frames that?
Yeah, I would say that I think what's really important to realize is that during this time of the pandemic, in all of its elements, what we're really experiencing is a lack of recognition of symbolic orders, right? Like we don't really understand who we are and what society is for, and in particular, how individuals who've been incarcerated may need to re-enter into those symbolic orders. Right, Brian Stevenson, right, famous author of Just Mercy, will say that, you know, we live in a society in which people are identified by the worst thing they did on their worst day, which is fundamentally opposed to the temporal nature of the human that Recur draws out so much in his work on narrative identity. I would say that, right, there are pretty clear relations between the racial injustice in the history of the United States and the mass Black incarceration pandemic that we live in right now. But I think we also are really recognizing the ways in which the particular ways in which society warehouses incarcerated individuals is absolutely toxic when even flu breaks out, let alone something as unprecedented as COVID-19. And so the only way that one has to handle it is to then isolate the individuals who now have even less access to education and less access to connection than they had before, and then bringing with that, in the effort to try to avoid exacerbating physical health issues, exacerbating mental health issues, because of what we know about the fundamentally social nature of the human and the ways in which segregation or isolation can aggravate that sense of mental health crisis.
And so, like, on the one hand, what you describe is just this terrifying world where there seems like there's very little hope, but your work is, your chapter is so inspirational, talking about the transformative possibilities of education in a way that I had not really ever encountered in the kinds of classrooms that I'd been in. Can you describe your sense of hope and the hope that you see for higher education moving into the next few years in the future?
Yeah, I would say, like Eric, I'm a little skeptical of at least a misunderstood conception of hope, as I imagine everyone is here. We could bring a kind of Thomistic theological understanding of hope here. We could caution ourselves that hope is very different from optimism. We are experiencing right now the toxicity of the power of positive thinking from the White House. Right? And the notion that we should be optimistic is ludicrous. We could go with a Thomistic understanding of the infused theological virtue of hope. I'm inclined to appreciate Recur's desire to separate out, at least within philosophical discourse, the philosophical from the theological, and turn to what Recur has to say about the importance of Kant in his philosophy of religion. And right, so hope's not something we have to do, right? It's not something we should do. It is something we can do, but then it's this weird something that we even may do, as long as we do it right. And so I think that what I hope we're realizing in a very mundane sense is that we actually need to wire up prisons so that the individuals who are incarcerated, and I don't mean to make light of the need to reform the systems themselves at the fundamental systemic level, but that's not going to happen overnight. And what can happen much quicker is actually wiring them up so that the individuals who are experiencing incarceration can actually use these technologies to get high quality humanities education and other types of education as they wish to pursue that, right? And then also use these same infrastructures that I think institutions of higher education as representatives of society have an obligation to provide in order also to connect with their loved ones, right? In other words, higher education has a responsibility to help society create Zoom, right, for people who are in prison, both so those individuals can have access to education, both for its instrumental purposes upon reentry, but also for its fundamental intrinsic worth, right? And also use that infrastructure for something that is even more important to those individuals, which is how can I connect with my 5-year-old daughter who lives 3 states away because I happen to be incarcerated over here in this state. So I'm hopeful that we can actually recognize our responsibilities and put those material infrastructures in place.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And for the reminder too about the nature of hope, one thing that I really appreciated working with Jeff on the introduction was looking at hope in its subjunctive tense as the could be trueness or the maybe trueness that has absolutely nothing to do with the really, both at its best vacuous and at the worst viral problems of positive thinking and that kind of positivistic psychology that comes out of the White House. So thank you for the reminder and for your article and all the work you do, man. I appreciate it. It's good to see you again. And now on to Vera. Vera, I'll let you introduce yourself and your project and go from there.
Hi, thank you, Daniel and Jeff, and thank you for everyone else on this panel. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak with you today and to have had the opportunity to read through Rapport in this context. So I'm Vera Rose Smith. I'm an independent scholar, an architectural historian, an artist, and an educator. And my chapter is called Memory, History, and the Forgotten. I'm looking at Rapport's last major work, Memory, History, and Forgetting, which investigates the extent to which history depends on memory, and specifically whose memories are considered historical. The summation of decades of work, this treatise begins with a rigorous overview of the phenomenology of memory and the impossibility of personally remembering the unlived but shared past. Rapport expands this impossibility through a review of history as a practice and as an academic discipline. For him, written history is a narrative icon that only selectively represents the past. This selectivity of perspective threatens the truth of history. As a representation of a sliver of a whole, the writings of the historian are at best inadequate, and at worst, a manipulation of the past to serve present purposes. So I'm looking at how Rapport's philosophies map to 3 central questions in American higher education. Specifically, what is college for? Who is college for? And who decides what and who college is for? And I attempt to do this through a really brief, breakneck speed run through the history of higher education in the United States. And through this, I weave in a personal narrative as a rural, low-income, first-generation college attendee and graduate that helps highlight the issues of access and representation in institutions of higher education.
Yeah, and your work was so poetic and so profoundly, deeply, vastly historical, and the way that you were able to bring those together, I thought I really, really enjoyed editing through it. So thank you again for all the work you did in contributing that. Given those experiences, both the historical nature of it, your own practice as an educator, your own biography as a student, how are you looking at the work that you did in bringing that chapter together as a lens through looking at what justice has interruptions to how we've sensed justice's meaning and the kind of new possibilities for understanding justice that have come out of since when you started working on the chapter?
There's no justice when there is no collective understanding of identity that fails to include all people as individuals and as embodiments of lived experience and as physical archives. So in light of COVID-19, in light of ongoing struggles for racial justice in this country, this writing has taken on not necessarily new meaning for me, but has helped elucidate the absolute necessity of transformation of higher education and recentering these questions. What is college? Who is it for? Who decides, right? And I am thinking a lot about how, especially in my teaching practice, as we all went online in the spring, there was such a stark contrast in the ability to focus and the space and time in which my students occupied based on their lived experiences, which were vastly different from each other in this pandemic. My white upper middle class students who come from a long line of college going family members struggled the least, I think, in many ways, but that's not to minimize the struggle of still living this moment, of course. But then I had students who returned home to Columbus Junction whose direct family members became part of the worst outbreak in the state of Iowa early on in this pandemic because they were here as undocumented workers from Mexico in these abysmal factory conditions for meat processing. And how can that student, who is absolutely equally intellectually capable as my white upper middle class students, be expected to perform the same intellectual labor in that same space that we create together at an institutional level when their lived experiences in the same time are so different? Whose history matters? So I just feel a renewed sense of urgency around exploding expertise, elevating lived and embodied experience as a type of expertise worthy of scholarly attention and of entry into a historic archival record.
And what hope allows that sense of urgency to not look at a pit of despair, but to really give you a bridge forward and to keep moving passionately as an educator into the future?
I mean, the pit of despair is pretty deep right now, I think. But in shadows, there are so many possibilities, right? What we can't see yet is hopeful. And thinking about who we can employ to create new methods of vision together, collaboratively, is really hopeful to me. And thinking about, especially now that my educational context has changed and I'm working with younger learners who have yet to come to college, thinking through their eyes what college does and what it is and what it can be and the necessity of that or not in their lives. How can we have a rigorous intellectual culture that allows for a diversity of viewpoints that is not institutionalized in the same breath as white supremacy? I think we're at a moment where that feels more possible because of this gaping pit of despair that we have to figure out a way to cross.
Yeah, and that's a good reminder too of just the notion of the unhoped for, and the fact that the hope that we have, or the hope that we think that we should have 2 months ago, is not the hope that becomes available to us as time moves on, and how from a situation where you're clinging to straws and trying to say like, there needs to be something or I can't go on, that and sometimes time itself unveils possibilities for the unhoped for that seem impossible at one point, but become commonplace reality later on. And I think that what you write is a really good indication of how, as flawed as higher education can be, like it still can serve as a site of hope for so many people. It was so much fun to just read through and edit your work. And thank you again for sharing it. And Jeff, if you want to re-enter into the conversation and lead us into the next stage, we'll go from there.
Yeah, and again, thank you to all of the contributors to this volume. And this is really only a taste of some of the work that is the composite of this volume, centering the question of the just university. So as we put this panel together and began to think through ways for us to have this discussion, very quickly, Daniel and I as co-editors continued to come back to our current context. And one of the things that all of the panelists have presented that are centered in their project is how much change has happened from the time we began this project together as writers, and the world has shifted on its axis, literally and figuratively, as we've brought it to its conclusion. One of the things that centered much of the discussion thus far, and I want to open this up to the panelists to just enter into discussion with each other, is as you heard the discussion happen thus far and the contributions to the approach of this, we continue to look at this question of what is the future of higher education? And I'm not asking you as panelists to think of yourselves as like an Alvin Toffler future shock kind of futurist, kind of looking at your 8-ball, trying to figure out what's going to happen next. But the world has shifted in so many ways that the question of the future of higher education is something everybody's chomping at the bit to figure out. What do you think what future is RECORE pointing us to? I want to return back to that question. What should the future be now that the world has shifted, as we've been addressing questions of white supremacy, police brutality, irresponsible political engagements, siloed conversations, toxic social media. We can go on and on and on, the environmental crisis writ large. So for you, and I would like to just, and anybody can jump in here, what do you think the future should be for higher education? What would be some ways you would want to center that discussion? And anybody can raise their hand and jump right in.
Howard.
So these are great questions. In preparation for this, I decided, well, I can't really reread all of RECORE, right, in the next couple of days before we jump on here. But what I did pick up, I think, is pretty good reading for this time, which is the set of interviews published under the name Critique and Conviction. It covers so many different topics that are so important here. And I'm drawing out from that two distinctions or two comments that RECORE makes that seem especially pertinent given President Trump's announcement the other day of the creation of the commission, the 1776 Commission for the refiguration of historical education within the United States public schools. And there are two things important to say there. The first is that RECORE makes a very astute observation that the difficulty of education is that it lies in a middle position between the responsibility of the state and the responsibility of civil society, but with a hard lean towards its being the responsibility of civil society and not as an arm, a propagandistic arm of the state. The second thing that he notes there that I think is really pertinent is that education has two elements to it. One is it has an informative element. And here, actually, RECORE might be sympathetic with a less disingenuous concern about representing US history in ways that create a sense of shared purpose, shared values, sort of a David Brooks RECORE. And so he notes that we need to be literate, right? RECORE can sound rather curmudgeonly at times, right? When he's saying, you know, the kids go into the museums now and they can't even identify the Madonna and Child. It's like, okay, well, just calm down a little bit, right? But that's an important point, right? And the second part is it's not just about information sharing, it's about discussion. You have to learn how to talk about the key debates, and those discussions need to be situated within the particular context of society. And so, right, RECORE again in Critique and Conviction, last little point, is he says, the USA has a strange history. He says, I know of no precedent for it in the history of Europe, at least, where a bunch of European colonizers come in, there's a pre-existing people there. You basically kill them. I mean, he says this, right? You basically kill them off or put them on reservations, and then you import an entirely second group of oppressed people and you enslave them. So whatever discussion you have about who America is, you have to take that history seriously and build from that towards some sort of shared set of convictions. So I think that it's not unusual to say that RECORE's trying to find a middle way between extremes. So I think looking at RECORE's Critique and Conviction on education in the history of the United States would be really helpful this time.
I'd like to pick up where you were talking about literacy, Howard, where I think for me, some of the questions that are preserved, they're kind of the same questions of the future of higher ed before the pandemic, because it's not as if the institutional inequities that are being exacerbated and exposed to more people weren't already happening before. And so a lot of these questions about the future of higher ed were already being discussed, right? So for instance, if the academic community or academic institution itself is a mechanism of maintaining white supremacy, then the changes need to be radical. It can't just be reform. And so I think particularly about, for instance, like the canon in Western philosophy, right? Like how do you redesign philosophy curriculum so that it's not just additive for to even say non-Western philosophy is itself an illiterate way to talk in a globally minded context, right? So what does literacy even mean when we don't have a shared discourse, a shared text that creates the community, right? So when we have a political contestation over which texts should be read, I think it makes the question of literacy more difficult because, and that's why I think I turn to recur on translation. That it's less about having shared texts and more about being able to translate from different language communities. So my hope is that we can do more of that, which I think we were doing before this too.
And Vera, and then Charlie, I'd like to hear about what you think about community, and Laura about what you think about criticality related to this conversation after Vera shares. Go for it.
Thanks. So I was thinking about, as both Howard and Nathan were speaking, the phenomenology of memory in the Ricorian sense and the creation of archive, right? And we are living in such a hopeful time in terms of literacy, particularly for me as an art historian, architectural historian, visual literacy, right? So many more people than ever before in the history of humanity have access to creating an archive of their own lived experience in real time. And it's chaos right now, right? How we start sorting that archive, how the professionalization of archiving continues to evolve through this digital era when so many are able to be literate in the tools of documentation is really, really exciting, and I think could lead to a type of new world order in shared memory making and a collectiveness around what we are as a people and how we move forward.
Charles?
In listening to this conversation, I've been so struck at the way that, for me, Ricoeur helps us to reimagine what the boundaries of university community are. I've been thinking a lot about his dialectic of the just between the good and the legal. And I think sometimes we create our own dialectic of the university as serving our mission and serving our communities, the town-gown relationship. And I wonder if one of the hopes of our situation is to build on some of the comments of the folks on this panel, to think about either connecting universities to those who are incarcerated or thinking about the kinds of communities we're educating who needs to be literate in a certain sense, as moving beyond the university as a walled off, separate group of people asking these questions in the so-called ivory tower, but instead to think about higher education as something that embraces the community it finds itself, literalized in the fact that due to social distancing, many of our students are now learning from their homes, and that creates an educational space that before, one of the missions of college was to send you away from that home life to go reflect on what it means to tell your story as a fully functioning member of educated civil society. And instead, I think our moment right now can allow us to think about higher education as forging more porous boundaries and ways to think in which our intellectual labors can be shared both globally because we have the technology to do so, but also to think about new ways to relate with the people we're living side by side with on a day-to-day basis.
Laura?
Yeah.
In terms of criticality and appropriation, I think that I really want to hear what you'd have to say to that.
And again, some of it connects so nicely with some of what Charles is saying. There is this moment, right, where if we think about criticality as this way of talking about the formation of self-critical persons with the assumption that that process is always ongoing. Persons are located in communities. And so the assumption that the educational process includes this formation that actually in a criticality model and using Ricoeur's hermeneutics you could argue requires that communal engagement, is, I think, one of the really exciting things that was sort of already a conversation before we went into lockdown, in terms of what counts as research, what counts as, right, this notion that students don't come as blank slates, but they have lived experience, and how is that lived experience, which helps highlight the fact that we all come socially located. How is that lived experience an important contribution to the classroom, to developing a community of learners that reflects a broader diversity of experiences and of ideas? That's part of literacy. We use this term information literacy, that to me is just loaded, in part because really we're only talking about information. And again, whose information are we talking about, right? Like it's this question. So I think there is an opportunity, especially because of the way in which almost everyone right now is so stuck in their own particular location, of recognizing this blur or the connection between our lived experiences and the educational process in a way that often, sort of traditional Western models of education have been less able to recognize that link. I think the other thing that comes to mind to me here when I think about Ricoeur is some of what he says about narrative identity, where both as individuals, especially in this moment, but more largely as institutions, and as part of the educational process, what does it mean to recognize we're never really talking about the identity of a person or a group if we're just stuck with a list, like, of attributes, right? Like, these are entirely insufficient. And so it feels like there's also this opportunity, because of the locatedness of learners in communities. I mean, we're always located, but you know what I mean? That there's an opportunity to recognize what's needed in terms of a far richer understanding, but also description of identity, of persons as persons, but also of communities of persons and institutions. And that part makes me a tiny bit hopeful about the future of higher ed, because it means there's a way to tell the story differently, right? It's like weaving a tapestry, and when you add in different threads, then the pattern, the beauty and the limit of what was there before changes in light of how what's added reframes it. And that there is opportunity here.
Yeah, and for those of you who are excited to read the book, Richard's chapter on looking at the Argonauts is greater narrative identity. But actually, Jeff, your chapter on looking at the literary and the canonic self, I think works really well as a follow-up to Laura's comment. If you want to go ahead and talk to the notion of narrative identity.
Yeah, just briefly, my chapter really is centered on the classroom experience. And one of the challenges that I've had over the years in the classroom has been to truly listen, see, hear, and experience the bodies that come into my room, that sit, and the surplus of meaning that my students bring into the classroom, and how does the classroom experience allow for the flourishing of all humans in that space so that their stories and their context are taken seriously. Ricoeur has been very helpful to me over the years to think about the narrative realities of what it means to be a self and the complexities of selves that come into our room. And I think in particular, one of the lectures, one of the articles that I really drew from in my chapter, Religion, Atheism, and Faith, which is very little slight reflection that Ricoeur did years ago, but looking at the nature of a necessary atheism that we need to bring into our context when talking about religion. How do we remove the shelter, as Ricoeur says, to allow there to be more things happening in the room? And so my chapter, I do a lot of conversation with James Baldwin, Bell Hooks, Ta-Nehisi Coates, trying to center voices that move away from the white canon and kind of bring into relief the many stories of how individuals are in the space. And I think also that really connects well with Daniel's chapter, which I want to make sure that, Daniel, you talk a bit before we close, on the role of fallible pedagogy and the role of vulnerability plays in this space. And so, Daniel, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about that work, because it really inspired me when I think about assessment and how I think about assessment differently.
Yeah, I started out with just the notion that fallibility really makes it hard to test, because as graders, as academics, you are required to give a grade and to assess and to evaluate. But the way that that's done in a college setting is really counterintuitive when it comes to how people actually learn and how they grow. And so I looked at the Pedagogy of the Oppressed. I looked at Maxine Green's Dialectic of Freedom, and just looked at the dialectics of what learning means and the role that fallibility plays with that, where rather than looking at failure, which we tend to do as academics, where nobody wants to fail a class or to fail or whatever, if getting a C is a failure or a B is a failure, to look at fallibility as part of learning and a joyful part of learning. And I think in some ways the joy of our fallibility is something that's been stolen from us, in part by higher education, if not like that notion that we can't make mistakes, that you get 3 months to create this artifact of something, and then that's what you're judged on. And after those 3 months, that's it. Then that's the cutoff. But that's so wrong. and so, I mean, just what I try to do is look at, just practically speaking, a couple of different models for testing that allow for more of a fallible approach to education than a right or wrong or something like that. So that was one of the things that I tried to do in the chapter, but more broadly speaking, just try to open up the space for fallibility to be a really revered part of what we do. And to me, when I look at the world, that's what's still hopeful about it, is the fact that, I mean, we haven't failed the planet quite yet. We haven't failed the people in this country quite yet. We've proven that the way things have run have been fallible, right? And we have a lot of learning left to do, but I think that the world is also showing that there's a vast community of learners and thinkers and creators that have a great wish to participate deeply in the meaning of what America is, and that there's an increasing awareness from those who have dominated the conversations to back away from the center of that and to allow other people to show why certain approaches that have been prioritized are fallible, and to expand beyond that. So that's part of what I've been hopeful about. Even watching the world fall apart, to know that sometimes hope comes through the falling apart of things. Hope comes through the fortunate fall, right? And then dialectically, we can build a better model of what could be. That's the subjunctive notion of hope, based on the failure of what has happened. So that's probably enough of my 3 cents.
No, that's great.
Yeah.
And Daniel and all the other panelists, thank you so much for your contributions. Unfortunately, as Ricoeur reminds us in the temporality of our narrative, we are out of time. So we are going to be closing off this panel discussion. We hope that all of you at the conference engage this volume and the good work of our panelists, who really do provide a great surplus of meaning to really what it means for us to be educators, to be academics, both inside and outside of higher education at this time. And we're hoping that these conversations continue forward. So again, thank you to the panelists and the participants of this volume, Paul Ricoeur and the Hope of Higher Education. And we look forward to continuing the conversation with you all. So from Daniel and myself as co-editors, we thank you for your time.